Thank you all for joining me. This is great. I'm seeing several faces who couldn't make it last time or making this time. I know we're conflicting with the ETT class right now, but it's really exciting that we got people coming. I hope that my contribution here is useful. And so today we're joining the thinker here, who is contemplating some possible climate futures. After I put this slide together, I Googled, this sculpture, the Thinker, which from the late 1800s, and it was meant to represent this guy who was contemplating hell as envisioned by Dante, and trying to write poetry to keep himself out of it. And maybe that's appropriate analogy somehow. I'm not sure. So last time we talked a little bit about weighing our carbon footprint, figuring out what is the footprint of different activities. In some ways, that was actually a pretty easy problem to look at, because we have a pretty good understanding of how different things like CO2 influence the climate, and we can take some activity and just try to measure what are the different pieces of climate influencing stuff that come out of this. Today, I'd say we have actually kind of a more difficult problem, because we're talking about the future. And ultimately, we don't know what's going to happen in the future. And so I'm going to try to provide some way that we can actually have a conversation that's not completely all over the map about this. And with the purpose of this being resiliency, so resiliency being capacity to respond to changes, basically trying to put yourself in a position where things work out a bit better than they might otherwise because of ways that you prepared. So I think it's really useful to develop a framework for this kind of conversation. And really this whole talk, what I'm going to be doing is kind of outlining that framework, and then I hope we have that conversation afterwards. I'm not here to give answers, really. And so I'm going to give an example of a framework. This is actually very parallel to what we used last time, cost-benefit analysis. The idea is you look at the downsides and upsides, you kind of put them together for different choices you might make, different plans you might make, and see which one seems to look best. And so I'll give kind of a goofy example here. If you were to play Russian roulette, your option was either to choose not to play, get $10,000, or to play, and if you win, you get $2 million. We can do some math here. There are 5 empty chambers, 1 out of 6 times 2 million. That's your upside. Downside, 1 loaded chamber out of 6 times 7 million being the typical amount that people value their lives. And you add those together. That's according to the government actuaries. It's $500,000, which is considerably more than that $10,000. So cost-benefit analysis says, let's play Russian roulette. So now let's look at this in a different way. Scenario planning is really what I want to focus on today. And the idea here is instead of thinking, well, I want to come up with the most optimal outcome, it's looking at all the possibilities and trying to steer yourself in the most to make a choice that reflects that you don't know how things are going to come out. So one of the choices you might make is you might play the game. There are a couple of scenarios. You could get a bunch of money, but you might die. So, and then there's this third scenario that comes up if you don't play, where you get some money. Looking at that, if you're thinking, well, there's that one that really stands out where I die. I don't want to end up in that situation. So you make the choice not to play the game. So that framework might lead you to a very different conclusion. And obviously, this is a sort of goofy, simplistic framework. But this idea of scenario planning, and specifically something called robust decision making, which is just a version where your focus is let's not shoot ourselves in the head here. Let's not go to that worst possible scenario. It's what a lot of scientists are using versions of this. Government agencies are using versions of this to try to make some kind of a coherent decision looking at how much we don't know about our future given climate change. So part of this is a matter, it's like not predicting. It's instead, because we can make predictions all day long, it's really fun, but at least when I make predictions, I'm often wrong. What you can do more usefully maybe is to come up with possibilities, scenarios, and then to see, well, how is it that we might avoid the worst outcomes amongst these many scenarios? So here's just an example of some scenarios in more of the scientific context. Scientists looking at a couple of possible scenarios In red, one where we continue emitting CO2 at our ever-increasing rate. And blue, where we rapidly reduce our emissions. And what implications does this have for various natural systems? We've got temperature, we've got Arctic sea ice, pH, so the ocean acidification, and sea level rise. And one thing that's kind of interesting in here, if we stabilize our CO2, we see that 3 of these things also stabilize. So the temperature should stabilize, the Arctic sea ice should stabilize, the pH, the acidity of the ocean should stabilize, but sea level doesn't stabilize in that scenario. So that's one of the interesting little things you can see in here. Now, before getting into scenarios that are really specific to Seldovia, some examples, I do want to address one elephant in the room, I think. And so I'm wondering if anyone would be so bold to raise their hand to this question. In my experience, there are a lot of people who think it's very likely that in the next, let's pick a number, like 50 years or so, that things are going to come completely unglued, that our society is going to break down, that we're going to have anarchy, starvation. Is there anyone who'd be willing to raise their hand and say, yeah, that's what I think will happen in the next 50 years? Got Sadie here?
I can't wait. I'm going to play Russian roulette.
All right. Michael's putting it out there as a reasonable chance.
I don't believe in that, but I think if you look at the mass exodus that happened in war in Syria, that took 1 million people and fled them into the other countries, which is affecting their politics, you're going to see global warming do that 10,000 times or 10,000.
Well, in Syria it might be in part to
exactly.
Climate change.
But I mean, now everybody in these countries are going to have to flee, and I think, and that will change the politics and the dynamics of a lot of stuff. I mean, all over the globe.
Walt, too?
Yeah, well, only about 49 years ago, but I've often thought that, you know, something's going to come along. It's going to be mass disease or nuclear destruction or some weather event or disease or something like that that's going to trim us down. There's too many of us.
Yeah, I think, so one of the reasons I asked this question is when Aaron and I spent several months walking around Cook Inlet, we kind of posed not that specific question, but just a broader question. What do you think might happen in the next 50 years? And various different versions of that answer are very common. A lot of people are thinking in terms of possible complete breakdown of our social and economic system. And I can certainly appreciate that. I've been a fan of apocalyptic fiction since I was a little kid. I've studied disasters and I've seen places where things have been completely wiped out. So it's easy for me also to come to that same conclusion. It's not hard for me to put the pieces together in my head and be like, wow, that sounds bad. We've got a lot of people, really complicated system. We're really using our resources to their limit. But I think there's actually, so yeah, this is that scenario there.
That's tomorrow.
I also do want to, though, shed a little bit of sunlight on that stormy future. I think if we look at history, there are examples. We can look at the collapse in Europe after the Roman Empire, the Mayan civilization's collapse. There are cases where this went really badly, starvation, contraction of the population in history. But if we look at some of the most recent examples, it's surprising to me how resilient modern civilization is. And I think one of the most clear examples out there is the collapse of the Soviet Union. Between 1989 and 1991, it came completely unglued. It started as this huge, very complex, very powerful political and economic structure, and at the end of that it was gone. Not to say that everything worked out fantastically for the different countries that were part of that, but there were ways that those societies did show an ability to continue functioning at some level. So the mob took over police work in Russia. It's not exactly a good outcome, But Russia's still there. They didn't have mass starvation and a contraction of the population. In Cuba, they basically, their entire supply of oil was cut off in a very short period of time. Huge stress on the economy. They had to start farming with oxen instead of tractors. People were growing vegetables on their roofs. People lost on average, I think it's 20 or 30 pounds of body weight in this period. But society did not collapse. They did not all starve to death. So I want to, for the purpose of this, to set that apocalyptic scenario aside and focus on some things that I think are more immediately likely. And not that we need to forget that possibility, but I want to look at 3 scenarios that I think are a little more tangible and immediate in our future. And I'm not arguing that any of these are certain. What I want to argue is that they are plausible, and that when we are thinking about the future, we might want to include these in there. One of them is a change in the natural world. One is a political change. Does anyone recognize who that is?
I know, Governor of
Washington. Yeah, Jay Inslee. He's the only presidential candidate out there right now who puts climate change as their top issue. And then one is a societal change that relates to stresses from climate change. So that change in the natural world is the death of our forests. We had back in the late 90s, spruce bark beetle flooded across the Kenai Peninsula, wiped out a lot of forests, made it right to our doorstep, made it basically to jackaloff. We got lucky it petered out there. But it very well could have wiped out our forests. This happened again with the spruce aphid in 2015 and 2016. The spruce aphid, which has been having outbreaks further south and east for a long time, suddenly popped up in our area. It exploded. It was doing wonderfully. It heavily damaged, killed some trees in Homer. It was starting to show up here in Seldovia. But then we had a bit colder than usual winter in 2016, 2017, that winter.
You got us on the spit.
Yeah, you have the aphids out there? Yeah. It was some of those kind of coastal areas where it seemed to be first showing up. It was like down at Wadsworth and stuff too. And I think Reynolds had it there.
Spot.
Yeah. But we have just one species of tree everywhere. If an insect like that gets going, it can potentially explode and take over. Both cases we got lucky. Neither of these things are directly the result of climate change. But both of them, if you warm up the system, they do a lot better and it becomes more likely. And it's not just insects. There's also blowdowns. This is the December 31st blowdown in red here. So I can't quite reach.
2016, not
2016, sorry.
There was a storm at the same
here,
time.
And right there is the one on the Otterbahn. If you walk the Otterbahn, you see all the trees that were knocked down then. A very large blowdown. Right, so throughout town, right, there were a lot of trees that went down. At the scale I mapped this here, you can't even see that. That blowdown over at Hohen's Lagoon is pretty incredible. That's the largest I've seen in my life. Before and since, in the few years before and since, there have been a lot of trees blown down. I think it's increasing. And so here's this map. Now here's another map at the same scale, just a little bit south of us. And this is on Port Dick, and this is the storms from 2012. It may have been there's 2 storms. There's one maybe in 2011, or maybe it was all in 2012. And there's a 28-mile wide swath that, in some cases, 50% of the forest was flattened. This is a same scale on these two, so it gives you some sense of how big that is. So I think it's plausible that we might lose our forest, and that's something we could just be like, well, it might happen, and then we'll deal with that when that happens. But I do think there are things we could consider doing right now. We could consider planting more diversity into our forests, so we wouldn't have as much, like you go out to one of these blowdowns and plant something else there. Then at least there's something else if the insects eat all the spruce. Maybe actually other species would actually do better in windstorms, since spruce trees have these really strong limbs, so if they're going to blow down, the whole tree goes instead of just losing limbs. So I think there are things we could do with this scenario in mind. So here's a completely different scenario. If you look around the world, a lot of countries and other jurisdictions that are trying to do something about climate change, one of the things they've come to is putting what they call a price on carbon. It's either through a cap and trade program or through a tax, but in some way they're going to make it more expensive to emit CO2. And so from our perspective, what that would mean is increased price in all of our fossil fuel intensive things. So that's fuel for our cars, but also for the ferry, also for heating our homes. It's the natural gas that goes into our electricity. At the rates it's at right now, like if you look at British Columbia, which is kind of have some of the most advanced policies here, it would only be about 35 cents a gallon, which is not too big a deal compared to the sort of variability we've seen in fuel prices in recent years. But if you go to the extreme and you look at how much does it cost society to have the CO2 from a gallon of gasoline emitted, it comes in somewhere in the ballpark of $10 per gallon. Now with that sort of taxes, it would completely change what we could do here. It would probably that free Amazon shipping is going to go away. Now, we're already in a political battle as far as keeping the ferry operational. If you were to add that much cost to its operations, how would that work out? There are a lot of things that would be really difficult, and it might be something that if we were to stick with our current infrastructure, that would be very difficult for Seldovia to operate in those conditions. And there are other places where they're much more advanced in this, where they have found they've been working hard to have lower carbon intensity, emit less CO2 for their infrastructure. And so those places will do relatively well. And, well, maybe Alaska, conceivably, perhaps not under Dunleavy, but perhaps we could get to the point where we also have that resilience, either on a local scale, thinking as Seldovians, or a broader, thinking as Alaskans. And one last possibility kind of points in some ways in the opposite direction. There are things happening as a result of climate change that are making places less and less habitable, even within the United States. And so a really obvious example is rising sea levels. There are towns and cities on the East Coast where high tide is flooding in and into the streets on a regular basis. Whether you look at this in terms of the direct impacts of flooding your house, or the impacts on houses becoming uninsurable and the way that drives people out, things like that. This is something that may make those places uninhabitable in the future. And if they did that, they might consider coming to Alaska. We don't know. I mean, maybe they're going to look for places that are closer, but if those places are experiencing stresses as well, there are some things that might lead them to think about coming to Alaska. And, what if 2 million people move to Alaska? That triples our population, completely changes the landscape of the state, and it's very small compared to the number of people who might be displaced within the United States. So 13 million people are within 6 feet of sea level rise. If you look at the big farming areas, there's really good evidence that changing climate is going to reduce their productivity. And there's a clear correlation between reduced productivity and farmers leaving those places. Alaska is likely to see an increase in farming productivity. So that would be maybe a place where those people would move. I found this interesting quote by Dr. Camilo Mora in Hawaii, talking about the way Alaska might be the Florida of the next century, so by the end of the century. So in that scenario, I want to emphasize that this scenario is in some ways opposite of the previous one I presented. And that's kind of part of the point here, is that we don't need to know what's going to happen. We don't need to be sure, oh yeah, the population is going to triple in Alaska and it's going to quadruple in Seldovia. If we were sure of that, that'd be really useful, but we can't be sure of that. It is just dependent on too many uncertainties out there in the future. However, I think acknowledging that as a possibility, and also acknowledging that there could be stresses that would drive people out of Alaska, I think that can help us when we're talking about what can our community do to be more resilient in a climate change future. So I'm going to actually just, I know I put resiliency in my intro slide there, but I'm actually going to, I think that we can transition into more of a conversation here about some of these big questions, like what are the reasonable scenarios that we maybe should be considering. That's a pretty open question. You don't have to be sure about it. It's just a question of what might happen. And then what would we do? What are the implications of different choices we would make as a community that would fit with those possible scenarios? So does that seem like a good place to just leap off from here?